Saints facing critical challenges in the life of the Church. Eastertide Talks of 2017, organised by Luke Gormally at Guardian Angels Parish, East London.
It's a particular pleasure to introduce this evening's distinguished speaker. Professor dAvray is Professor of History at University College London. He is a medievalist specializing in the history of the Church in the West. I shall not recite his impressive list of publications. You can see them for yourselves in the leaflet for the series. I'll confine myself to drawing your attention to his membership of two elite bodies. He is a Fellow of the British Academy, election to which means that in the eyes of his peers, he is to be counted among the more distinguished historians in Britain. Secondly, he is a member of the Pontifical Committee for Historical Sciences, a select international body of historians consulted for one purpose or another by the Holy See. His subject this evening in our series on saints confronting critical challenges in the life of the Church is Pope St. Gregory VII and the Gregorian Reform. Professor dAvray.
Okay, Gregory VII. I don't think you'll find any statues of Gregory VII up in any of your churches, and I don't think he has any particular popular following. I think he's a very interesting saint who can tell one something about sanctity and the Catholic Church in general. You're a different sort of audience from the kind I normally speak to. Normally I speak to university students. For a lot of the time I'm going to speak to you in the same way. I speak plainly to university students. I try to be direct. But I'm used to talking to students who don't have any religious background normally, and it's always seemed to me an important thing to be able to talk to them in a way that doesn't build any of my own religious assumptions into my arguments. So I'm going to do quite a bit of that to try and explain Gregory historically. But at the end, I'm going to try and then speak as a Catholic and say what he can tell us, I think, about sanctity and the Catholic Church. And I think those things are compatible. The historical, if you like, the part when I speak to you as a historian, I think that's important. I think at the moment, our Catholic culture is very weak on that. The seminary training of priests has very little church history. It's weak in the great Catholic educational bodies, even in the big universities in Rome, the Catholic universities in Rome. It's not particularly strong. And when it is taught, it's taught in what I might say a boring and schoolmasterly way, in the sense that people will take you, through the main facts of church history, often, in fact, neglecting the Middle Ages, which is a pretty crucial period in Catholic church history, without really trying to explain it. And it seems to me that for Catholics, our religion is a very historical religion. If you are an evangelical Protestant, you might say, we have the Bible and we have the Holy Spirit talking to us, and that's all we need. But as Catholics, we're part of a church that lives in history, and I think it's something that I think even Catholic theologians of the last generations haven't really thought enough about, which is the relationship between their theology and history. We think of the sanctity of the church, which is something I believe in, but if you ask even the average Catholic theologian what they mean by the sanctity of the church, they will say, well, maybe the saints, as though the saints are like some separate category from everybody else and from the church in general, or the sacraments, as though the sacraments didn't have any history. So although for some of the time I'm going to talk to you as I talk to my gifted and intelligent students, because I think that you can take that, few of you will fall asleep, but I think the others will have no trouble in following it. I think that is relevant to what I'm going to say at the end, which is to try and explain, if you like, something about the relationship between saints and history, which goes beyond this notion that they're somehow little bright spots in a history which is otherwise a list of dates or a list of facts or a list of abuses or whatever. I also want to get away a bit from the idea that perhaps insofar as there is a pattern to the way history has been taught to, especially to Catholic priests, the idea that it's not false, but I think it's too simple, that you have the church, which is a kind of default setting, and then abuses come in, and there are abuses and abuses, and then you get a saint who reforms the abuses and lifts them up again, and then the abuses come in again, and then you get another saint or reform that reforms the abuses. And I don't think that, of course, that's true, and it's also true in the lives of every individual. Is that's how one's own life goes, I suppose. But it doesn't really capture, I think, the essence of how church history works, and I want to try and communicate a bit of that to you. I don't think this is something that you'll get in many other places, actually, because, of course, secular historians do not have the church as a religious institution at the back of their mind, and as I say, most Catholic history is not taught in a way that has any thought to its relationship to the church and its meaning. So either fall asleep or stay awake. And if you stay awake, be prepared to have to think a bit. So what I thought I'd do is, actually I'm going to begin in a schoolmasterly way by giving you some bare facts, because I'm taking it for granted that most of you know nothing about Gregory VII. A few of you will. I mean, some of you, there may be some people here who are experts on him, but I'm assuming that's not the norm. So I'm just going to give, firstly, some bare facts, and then I'm going to talk in an interpretative way, rather as I would to an audience of students or professors, but in plain language that doesn't presuppose anything, or I'll try not to presuppose anything, and then I'm going to come back to try and think about this as we might think about it as Catholics. So firstly, the very basic facts. So we're talking about the 11th century, so a long time ago, and it's 1,000 years ago, is that right? The basic facts are that there is a massive church reform which begins with a program with two prongs. The first prong is to stop priests living with women, clerical celibacy, which, well, the standard line is that there wasn't much clerical celibacy in the early Middle Ages. In fact, that's not absolutely true. It depended a lot where you were. So there were some parts of Europe where clerical celibacy was normal, and other parts where it wasn't. England was one of the parts where it wasn't, by the way. It would be normal for priests to have what you might call a partner, because for reasons I'll explain, it was very unclear whether they should be regarded as a wife or a partner. Then the other thing was people buying bishoprics and jobs as abbots with cash, sort of brown envelope culture. So put it like this all sounds like very straightforward abuses. And of course, that's exactly how the reformers saw it and how probably we would see it, but I'm going to explain how it happened. I mean, it didn't just come out of nowhere or just out of people being bad. And then the third prong, and this is perhaps where Gregory VII makes his distinctive contribution, is the idea that the church should not be run by monarchs. And he becomes increasingly and aggressively obsessed with the idea that the church should be free from control by emperors and kings. Okay, so that's the very bare facts. So first of all, emperors and kings. Now, just want to try and sketch to you what Europe is at that time. One thing that many of you may know at any rate, this is the time of William the Conqueror. This is the time of William the Bastard, as he's called in other countries, Guillaume le Bâtard. So England, 1066, England is conquered by the Normans. So that gives you one fact on the ground that some of you will know. To look around Europe, if you go to the other end of Europe and you look at Sicily and southern Italy, that has also been conquered by the Normans. I mean, those Normans were something else. I was going to say, I don't know how they did it, but actually there is a theory of how they did it, which is that they had better horses than anyone else. They trained their bloodstock brilliantly, so it was like they had the best tanks. But anyway, one way or the other, and also they obviously had a lot of energy and ideas, because anyway, so they're in England and they're in southern Italy. A big block of northern Italy is a secular state which the Pope rules. So the Pope, in a way, has two hats. He has his hat as the head of Christendom, and he has his hat as the ruler of a block in central Italy. And that continues to this day, except the block is a very small one, which is the Vatican City. If you move to northern Italy, you have Italian cities. And again, you're in territory that's not totally unfamiliar, because if any of you have been to Italy and seen what some of the smaller Italian cities, they would have looked not a million miles, not absolutely different from how they look, not absolutely different from how they would have looked in the 11th century. If you sometimes, small, compact, big block, lots of small streets, etc., strong sense of identity, they are beginning to more or less run their own show, but technically they're under the empire. So what is the empire? So the empire is the Holy Roman Empire, and the Holy Roman Empire is a block that it covers roughly what the European Union used to be round about the mid-70s, until England joined it. Britain, sorry. So France, Germany, the countries in between, the Low Countries, and Italy. That is pretty much what the Holy Roman Empire was ruler of. It's a very large area, very large area. And he ruled it in part because he ruled it through bishops and abbots. So he was able to control this large area because he appointed bishops and abbots. And bishops and abbots at that time were not only spiritual rulers, but they had huge amounts of temporal power, huge amounts of secular power as great landowners, but also judicial power. That's something that didn't exist in England in the same way. The one exception is Durham in England. That's the Bishop of Durham in the Middle Ages was a prince bishop, and he had royal power in addition to his power as a bishop. And he had that power because of the Scots. So he was expected to keep the Scots at bay. But in Germany it's quite normal, and up until the French Revolution there were lots of abbeys and bishoprics which were also states. And sometimes the state didn't coincide with the diocese of the bishop, but it was quite a normal thing. And Napoleon swept all of that away, but this lasted for a long time. So the emperor is able to govern through these things. These things have the great advantage that abbots and bishops don't have legitimate sons. And that means that when the abbot or the bishop dies, the king gets to appoint them again, and there isn't some tough 18-year-old who expects to be able to step into his father's shoes and rule, and who isn't grateful to you like his dad was. So that's Germany, a strong state at that time. It had got strong a few generations before by beating the Hungarians. Hungarians in the 10th century, a lot of trouble, and the first great Holy Roman Emperor defeated them at a crucial battle, pushed them out, and the dynasty, there would be a series of dynasties. They're still strong. France is lots and lots of little states. Lots and lots of little states. And finally, what kind of society is it? The economy is mostly rural, but already it's beginning to be to have a lot of commerce and trade. If you go to Italian cities, they're developing fast. It's obviously it's a different kind of economic development, but it's kind of like China in the last 30 or 40 years. Very, very fast economic developments. And this is relevant to what happened to bring about this reform movement that Hildebrand, Gregory VII, is involved in. Okay, so that's the basic setting of the scene. I should add a few things. Parishes are beginning to be a fact on the ground. in Northern Europe. The parish system did not exist in the Roman Empire. What you had mostly in the Roman Empire is a Christian community around a bishop in a city. And that's really quite important for what I'm going to go on to say. And I mean, they wanted to reach out as far as they could, but most of the countryside is pagan. Pagan means countryman. So part of the story I'm going to tell is that the countryside had been Christianized, but that meant establishing parishes, and parishes are a very different kind of institution from Christianity as it was at the beginning of the Middle Ages, the end of the Roman Empire period. And in some parts of Europe, parishes haven't yet developed, and what you have is sort of team ministries which serve larger areas instead. In many ways, Catholic life would be the same. The Mass would be a Latin Mass, but quite familiar to any of you who've been to a Latin Mass, especially the Tridentine one. That would be about the same. There wouldn't be a list of 7 sacraments, a clear list of 7 sacraments. So theology had not yet decided that all of the 7 sacraments were there in one form or another, but people hadn't made a list of what counted as a sacrament in the modern sense or not. So that would have been a difference. No universities, nothing like Queen Mary College next door yet. Monasteries, very big and powerful. Bishops, big and powerful. Okay, right. So that's the school teacher bit. Now I'm going to move on to a sort of university lecture bit, and I'm going to try and explain in exactly the same terms as I might to a completely secular audience about how this reform came about and why it came about. And I think it's important as a preliminary to say, and this may be true of other reforms too, that it didn't come about just because of people being bad. It came about because of changes which had knock-on consequences which produced a situation that seemed scandalous, and perhaps was scandalous, but once you understand how they came about, you can see how they got to that position. All right, so what are these changes? Okay, so I've just now saying that there wasn't a parish system in the late Roman Empire, and that what you have is the bishop. You have large numbers of clergy around the bishop. Now, important thing, I don't know how many of you know this, but celibacy meant something different at the end of the Roman Empire in the West from what it came to mean. The assumption, if you stop the clock in the 5th century, the pattern for a life as a clergyman would be that if you were brought up as a Christian, you would join the clergy quite young, and you went through a whole series of stages as priests did up until the Second Vatican Council and the Tridentine, the priests in communion with Rome still do. But really quite young, you would get married. Now, this is not as a priest, but when you were a clergyman already, in what are called the minor orders of the clergy, acolytes, that kind of thing, lectors, exorcists. There's another one which I forget, Luke would know it. You'd get married, and you'd have children, and then this might go on for about 15 years, and then at some point you would decide whether you wanted to rise higher, which at this point meant becoming a deacon. If you wanted to become a deacon, at that point you had to commit to giving up sex, but you didn't separate from your wife. So the celibacy in the end of the 4th and the 5th century in the West, Eastern Europe is different, complicated, but this is the West, meant celibacy within marriage. And you didn't have to do it. You could stay a subdeacon. There was attempts to push this down to subdeacon, but they didn't really catch on. But in late antiquity, it happened later. So, and if you wanted to continue, you and your wife had to commit to celibacy, but you continued to live together. Now, I think that this is more realistic than it might sound. Firstly, these would be couples that had already lived together for 10, 15 years. They'd have had children. Secondly, it was a voluntary choice. And thirdly, and this is very important, there would be strong moral pressure within this quite tight-knit community around the bishop in cities to observe this. i.e., which in absence birth control, not to get pregnant. And this control would come especially from the wives. So celibacy in the 5th century meant marriage without sex after a certain point, but a society full of women. Very interesting. Full of wives. And this is something perfectly orthodox, don't worry, and perfectly well known to historians. But even historians, secular historians, it's like they don't imagine it. You know, they know it in theory, but they don't imagine that these city communities were full of wives. Okay, now, I think that for a while this was a realistic model, but as time went by, it began to become unrealistic, and I think it became unrealistic as Christianity extended to the countryside. So what you find in the early Middle Ages is, on the one hand, cities are fading away. This is, you know, we're talking about the effects of the end of the Roman Empire. And one of the effects of the Roman Empire is that trade falls off and cities become depopulated. They become like a shadow of the former selves. Roman ruins, etc. And if it's a bishop's city, the bishop is still a going concern, and there would be stuff going on around the bishop. But all the stuff that made a Roman city a big deal, the baths, the theatre, lots and lots of trade and merchants, that fades away. On the other hand, Christianity is spreading to the countryside. So by, let's say, about the 9th century, the countryside is Christianized, especially by the 9th century, because the guy who starts the Holy Roman Empire, Charlemagne, father of Europe he's called, he is a big reformer. I mean, you know, he is like your classic reformer. He says, you know, we want people to be more Christian. He introduces a script, which is the basis of the script you read yourself. When you read a printed book, the script you're using is modeled on the script that this guy introduced at the end of the 8th century. He cleaned up Latin so that people started writing perfectly correctly. If there are any classicists you hear, you know, you probably have prejudices about medieval Latin. Actually, medieval Latin is fine after Charlemagne. And he really tried an educational program. So there's an attempt to Christianize the countryside, and parishes, first of all, you get, I think, these sort of team ministries, and then what they're moving towards is an ideal where any family can walk to church on Sunday. So if you think of England today, if you go around England in the countryside, you have these stone churches wherever you go, often medieval churches. And if you think about the difference between these medieval churches is usually the boundary is about the distance a family could walk to church without great discomfort. So that's what they were aiming at, is to have a church within walking distance of everybody. And they get that. But what they lose is these communities of clerics. So throughout this early medieval period, clerical marriage is never actually banned by the church. It's still legal for a clergyman to be married. But, of course, the canon law of the church said absolutely explicitly that once you're a deacon, that means marriage without sex. But it's one thing to have this tight-knit community around a bishop, you know, all supporting each other to do that. It's another thing if you've got a sort of peasant country priest by himself with his wife or concubine, with no support or anything like that. I should say no seminary education, nothing like that. These priests they're not trained at any kind of theological college or anything. They're sort of peasant guys, a lot of them. And celibacy ceases to have any kind of plausibility in that period. So it's quite normal, at least in many parts of Europe, for these priests, you know, to have a passel of kids and what? A wife, a partner. There's one charter which is signed by a bishop, an archbishop, and an emperor, I think, which is about some senior ecclesiastic and his faithful, his fidelis amandula. And I would translate that as partner, his partner amandula. It's all very respectable. But it's, on the other hand, it's very different from what canon law says. And canon law is still known. This is an important thing. The canon law, which is fixed in the 5th century, continues to be copied and continues to be widely known. Okay, then you have something similar when it comes to how you appoint bishops. Now, in late antiquity, in the late Roman Empire, it's a bit uncertain how you appoint bishops. The Council of Nicaea says that you should, that's the 4th century council, it's the first general council, most people recognize, unless you count the Council of Jerusalem in the Acts of the Apostles. Council of Nicaea says the bishops of a province should elect a bishop. And the metropolitan, that's like the Archbishop of Canterbury equivalent, or Vincent Nichols in the Catholic hierarchy, should approve it. But the trouble is, what was a province? The church was trying to arrange its provinces around the provinces of Roman secular government. But the Roman secular government, which was A, on its last legs, B, kept changing its provincial boundaries. So that wasn't very clear. And then a bit later, in the 5th century, a priest says, well, the bishop should be elected by the clergy and people. Okay, so what does it mean to be elected by the clergy and people? Well, actually, you can guess what it meant in the 5th century. You've got a still fairly tight-knit Christian community. And what this mean would be that the clergy and the movers and shakers among the laity. And we've all been in organizations where there are a few people who basically run it. And elections happen without anyone really knowing how somebody is selected, but basically there's a group of people who pull the strings and get the people they want. But when you move from that situation, which are these cities in the Roman Empire, to the dioceses of Northern Europe, dioceses of Germany or England, these are enormous dioceses. You know, something like the Diocese of Lincoln in the Middle Ages is colossal. It includes Oxford. Oxford is part of it. Or, you know, those big German dioceses, colossal areas. What does it mean for the clergy and people to elect the bishop? You know, it can't mean anything. Now, on the other hand, these guys have lots of land and power. People have been throwing property at the church in the Middle Ages. You know, the church, by which I mean bishops and abbots, you know, it doesn't take people's property. People give it property. And then often, a few hundred years later, they take it back. Or sometimes even the next generation takes it back. But one way or the other, bishops and abbots have loads of property. People are giving them this property. And in those days, property meant people. It meant peasants who were working for you. And also, it meant political power, because you are the justice. You decide, you deal out justice to the peasants on your land. So property means power, and bishops and abbots have huge amounts of it. So hence we get to the system that I told you about, which is that kings find it. Firstly, there is no method, really, a workable method of appointing bishops. And secondly, it's incredibly convenient for kings to do that, because it's a way of running their enormous kingdoms without the problem that otherwise arises, which is that, let's say you're a king and you've got lots of land, supposing you've just conquered it like William the Conqueror. So, you know, you distribute it to your followers, say, I'm giving this to your lifetime, and your followers are really grateful to you. And then they die and their son comes along, and their son isn't grateful to you at all. He thinks he's entitled to it, and there he doesn't obey you. Now, if you do this with an abbot or a bishopric, you can continue to govern. So what I've been trying to explain is how, you know, what the abuses that these reformers got hot under the collar about were things that happened quite naturally as society changed. And as you moved from the society of late antiquity to an early medieval society, as the countryside was Christianized, as towns ceased to be the focal point of Christianity, as you got huge dioceses, all of this changed. Then there's one last change, which is important. The economy is picking up, like I said. And suddenly, it's becoming a money economy. I mean, in the early Middle Ages, there was never a period when there was no money. There was always some money. But actually, most of what you did without money. You know, the economy worked on people doing labor services for lords, and then they had land that they lived on, and gift exchange is very important. So there's not a huge amount of buying and selling, not a huge amount of trade. Always some, but not a lot. By the 11th century, there is a lot. The economy has really started to move. It's been called a commercial revolution. Now, one effect of this is that instead of, you know, using patronage and friends of friends to get these church jobs, You pay cash for it, brown envelopes. And this was an idea of a historian who's still alive, a man called Alexander Murray. He pointed out that one effect of the pickup of a money economy was you get more robberies, because you've got coins to rob, and you get simony, that is buying church jobs. More money economy, this is a new thing, you know, so that it's not as if there's been the same amount of purchasing church jobs for centuries. It's actually a new thing. As there is more money around, people use it to get good jobs. And as you can see, being a bishop or an abbot is a very good job in the sense that you have huge amounts of property and power at your disposal. Okay, so there you get to the situation where on the one hand you've got kings distributing jobs as abbots and bishops. You've got people who want these jobs paying the king's brown envelopes or the equivalent for them. And you've got the clergy who are, you know, living with women and having passel of kids. And then on the other hand, you still have a canon law which says that all these things are wrong. And this is the same situation, I think, that, you know, it's good to draw these analogies that you find in the history of Islam very often, because if you look at Islam in the 19th century, many Islamic countries were very westernized. And you could see that westernization has been a massive force in the Middle East, etc. Now, do not be surprised that many believing Muslims can see that a lot of Western culture, by which I don't mean Christian culture actually, I mostly mean secular, liberal Western culture, is incompatible with Islam. And it's not surprising that they realize that this is a sort of creeping takeover, and they can see that this is contrary to classical Islam. So a lot of the force of the reaction against westernization that you see to this day in countries throughout the Middle East and a country like Turkey has been because people can see the gap between what they know to be Islam, because they can, you know, not read the Quran, or because it's well known, it's in the system of Sharia law, and what they see as Western ways of life. And it's not surprising that sometimes they get angry about it. Now, that is what these reformers did. They got angry about it. And in a sense, you can see this was something that was going to happen sooner or later, because the church law was well known, and the gap between the church law and what people were doing was obvious. And at some point, you were going to get some guys who would say, this has got to stop. Now, I say some guys, and that's important. There were some women too, actually, but the guys made the running. I think an important part of the background of Gregory is that he wasn't alone. There was a group of maybe, you know, about 10 really strong personalities who were, I mean, one thing about Gregory, as I'll come to it, he is a fearsomely strong personality. But he wasn't the only one. There were others too, who were just as fiery. And these are you know, really aggressive and passionate reformers. They are not quiet, persuasive guys. And they excommunicate people at the drop of a hat. And they sack bishops. Once they get going, you know, it's not just Gregory VII. But he is the young, almost the second, he's there with them, but there's several other guys like him who are just as fiery. And what they start with is trying to stop priests having women and people paying money for church jobs. Now, in a sense, the old kind of celibacy, they couldn't even understand it anymore because the church had changed so much. The celibacy, you know, of clergymen living in a community close to the bishop with their wives is so different from what you find in parishes that the only way they could understand the celibacy rule would be no wives. So in a way, the old style of celibacy has just ceased to mean anything, and celibacy has come to mean that you have the priest and he isn't married. The marriage of priests is only actually declared invalid in 1139, so a generation after the Reform. But it's become a no-no during the Reform. So that's what they go for. Okay, so that's the first generation. Now, the interesting thing is, they have an ally in the emperor in this first stage. The guy, you know, who rules this huge area the size of the old European community, he's on their side. He's actually pushing for reform. There's especially Henry III, father of the guy who's the great opponent of Gregory VII. He is, he's supporting them in their attack on people buying jobs. He's supporting them in their attack to make priests live without women. As you imagine, there's loads of resistance to this because, if the average parish priest, suddenly somebody comes along and saying, you can't do what you've always done, they don't even understand it. So it's not as if your average parish priest, canon law is well known in the higher echelons, but your average peasant priest probably doesn't know much canon law. So whereas the reformers and anyone who reads canon law books knows that it's wrong for priests to have women, the average peasant priest doesn't know that. So they find it difficult. So this is a big clash. And Gregory VII is right in there. And what you find that the popes are doing is that they are going out and holding synods. Now, this is an unusual moment in papal history. Really, my speciality is papal history, going way back. And papal history does go way back. But most of papal history, popes respond rather than taking the initiative. Even today, most of what popes do is to respond rather than take the initiative. If the Holy Office gets involved with somebody who's accused of heresy, they haven't been reading their books. It's because somebody has written to them and said, so-and-so at the seminary is teaching that animals can be priests or whatever. They are responding. And it's quite unusual for, occasionally, you get someone like John Paul II introducing a new cycle to the rosary. But for most of papal history, popes respond. And if you like, the key to papal history has been they sort of sit there doing their own stuff, and then somebody comes from Northumbria or somewhere, and the popes, instead of saying, well, I'm sorry, we don't really do that kind of thing, they deal with it. They sort of straighten their tiara, and they give a response and act like a pope. But in this period in the 11th century, it's a really unusual period because because the papacy is taking the initiative. And it's before Gregory VII. And supported by the emperor. Now, then Gregory becomes pope himself. People must have realized he was in line for it because the same emperor who was backing the reform, this is probably true, it's one of these facts you can't establish for certain, made him promise not to become pope without the emperor's agreement or the agreement of his son. And Gregory says something. Gregory is sort of swept to the papacy by popular acclaim, and he says something like, the word of God told me I had to do it. And he is, throughout his life, he's very convinced that God is guiding him. Now, this is something that, many leaders of religions that we might consider false or heresies have also believed. But Gregory certainly was convinced of it. He's, all this time he's been one of the people who's been going to France and sacking bishops like nobody's business, etc. And now he's pope. Okay, so what does he do? He starts off with more. He's already got big ideas. I mean, he talks about the Greek Empire, Byzantium, now Istanbul, is still Christian, and they're getting a lot of trouble from the Turks, who of course eventually do conquer it. And they call for help. So Gregory has this idea of leading an expedition to rescue the Greek Empire. Now, historians laugh at this and say, it was ridiculous, that was never going to happen. Of course, a generation later, it did happen, and it turned into the First Crusade. There's a lot of things about Gregory are like that. He does things that are, you think, this is like Donald Trump, like really crazy statements, etc. And later on, actually, they happen. It's quite, he makes these vast claims. He has big ideas. There's one of the documents that historians have talked about, for centuries is called the Dictator of the Pope, the Dictatus Papae. And this is a list of propositions about the papacy, incredibly ambitious. Now, people have assumed that this is a great papal manifesto. Actually, it was never published. Probably what it was like a memo that he wrote for himself. And I think the best hypothesis is he hoped that canon lawyers would find authoritative legal backup for all his statements. And for some of them, they did, and for a lot of them, there wasn't any. But it tells you how he was thinking. It's really thinking on a kind of grandiose scale. But first of all, he's working with the emperor. But then they get into a head-to-head about the Archbishop of Milan. Now, Milan is still a great city, and in this period, it was possibly, I mean, the richest city in the West. I don't know. I mean, it's already very, very advanced in the 11th century. It's a big deal. And there are undercurrents going on in Milan. The Italian cities are limbering up to throw off the authority of the emperor, which they do later anyway. And that often in the history of the Middle Ages, there's sort of several different subplots going on. There's a papacy against somebody, but if the papacy wins, it's because somebody else is against them as well. Okay. So there's a dispute about who appoints the Bishop of Milan. There's a new Holy Roman Emperor who's a very young guy, and he, in the end, appoints his man for the Bishop of Milan, and there's a lot of popular feeling against him in Milan coming out of this reform movement. The reform movement has already started using the language of church freedom, independence, and basically Gregory excommunicates the emperor. Now, this is a decisive point, because up until this time, these reformers, they've been getting up everybody's nose. I mean, they've been absolutely fearless, if not ruthless, in attacking the establishment, but not the emperor. The emperor has been supporting them in it. And this is the moment where the Pope and the emperor are actually against each other. And that is the distinctive thing about Gregory VII, is that he took on the emperor. Really, before then, popes had avoided conflict with secular powers. If you think about it, there's a long history behind this. I've got to give a retrospect. Christianity in the early church is persecuted, and then, to everybody's astonishment, the emperor, Constantine, becomes a Christian, and suddenly the empire is supporting Christianity, and then it's banning paganism. And in a way, ever after that time, Christianity looked to the empire as a great support, and the popes too always like to have an emperor to give them backup. So there isn't any conflict with the empire until then. It's a huge change that he brings about. And also, in world history, it's a change. In virtually every society that has a religion, that is a dominant religion, either the state runs the religion or there is no difference between religion and the state. Ancient Near East, Rome, classical Greece, classical China, Hindu monarchies, Islam. In all of these cases, there is no distinction between religion and secular. And there is a constant tendency, when a religion is powerful, for whoever is ruling the state to also rule the religion, because it's too influential. And this doesn't happen in countries like America, because there are so many religions that they cancel each other out. But in general, the ruler of the state likes to be in control of the religion, or there is no distinction in people's minds between the two. So this was a big step. So this is the first stage, and then you get to the amazing Canossa. If in Germany, a Canossa is like a household word. It means humbling yourself before the Pope. I'm not going to go on the Canossa way. And what happened was that in this first conflict with the emperor, Gregory won. The emperor backed down, and he won because a rebellion broke out in Germany against the emperor. And in the end, the emperor came and he waited for this is a classic picture, 3 days in the snow in penitential garments until Gregory received him. Now, probably this was actually a peace treaty between them. It wasn't simply one-sided. Nonetheless, it was completely unprecedented. There was one precedent in the fifth, actually at the end of the fourth, about 400, with the Bishop of Milan, but pretty unprecedented. And this, in a way, made Gregory overconfident. And then he moved on to a second stage, which was to attack the process by which, when somebody became a bishop or an abbot, it was the king or the emperor who gave them the symbols of their office. And Gregory, for the first time, said, this has got to stop, because it sends a message that the church is run by the state, and this isn't right. So he started on that. Now, at this point, things began to unravel for him. Although he had sort of made peace with the emperor, actually, There were other people who wanted the emperor out. There was somebody else who was hoping to replace him. He went on fighting. The people in northern Italy who had been on the imperial side, they continued too. So actually, the fight went on. And eventually, the emperor who had submitted got fed up with this. And Gregory then thought he could do it all again and excommunicate the emperor and people would come to his side again. But this time they didn't. And to cut a long story short, in the end, he sort of lost. The emperor said, all right, we'll have another pope. I'll appoint another pope. And in the end, the emperor came to Rome and after, took several years of him sort of nearly doing it and not quite. Then in the end, he manages to get the new pope crowned. He gets himself crowned as Holy Roman Emperor in Rome. And Gregory is there the whole time in the Castel Sant'Angelo, which you can still see in Rome. And the sort of celebration feast that the emperor holds with him and his new pope was within sight of Gregory in this castle nearby. So he's very humiliating. And he has to take refuge with the Normans. This is the southern Italian Normans who, for their own reasons, really, didn't want the emperor to get too powerful. And then he dies. Okay. Now, what are we to make of this? Gregory is an extremist. And he's also aggressive. He is happy to talk about violence being used in the service of God. In some ways, he's unsympathetic to the modern mind, and especially in our culture when everybody is looking over their shoulder expecting to be blown up by some mad mullah, suicide bomber. The connection, the fact that he says violence in the service of God can be good, it's very, very much of a turn-off. And also, he lacks common sense in that he thinks, he excommunicates everybody. Not totally. He actually stays away from William the Conqueror. He has some sense of that you can't fight everybody at once. But he fights an awful lot of people at once. He excommunicates an awful lot of people. He's very intemperate. So you might say, where is the saint in all of this? Well, and this is well worth thinking about. Now, the first thing I would say was, if you look at the span of church history, he is one of the few people, individuals, who really made a difference. And the difference he made was establishing the idea that the church is not under the state. Now, there are some people who actually see this as the beginning of the notion of the completely secular state separate from religion. That wasn't what I would say, that wasn't an effect of it. And in a way, he was completely uninterested in secular things, actually. So he basically, he sacks the emperor, but it's all about who appoints bishops. He's not interested in settling disputes between great lay landlords or anything like that. He's not interested in that. But the idea that the church should not be under the state, only something as dramatic as his unsuccessful conflict with the empire could make such an impression on people's minds that that idea became established, as it did, because in fact nobody forgot it after him, and pretty soon the papacy was back with a winning streak. And I think you could say no Thomas Becket without Gregory VII. Thomas Becket is the same kind. He's also a bit of an awkward bastard. He's a difficult man, you might say. But he stands up to the King of England, who is, difficult man doesn't begin to catch it when you talk about the King of England, Henry II, because he's a man who uses fits of furious temper as a means of controlling people, and the death of Becket is a consequence of this. But the fact that it is okay to stand up to a ruler, this is the first time that it happens with Gregory VII. And it is a violent break with anything in the past in the history of the church. But partly it wasn't that the church had always been kowtowing to emperors. It was more the papacy really becomes a massive force at the end of the Roman Empire because the empire is collapsing in the West. So there are lots of different barbarian kings, and they are mildly heretical, so they're not under the Pope. So the Pope, in a sense, has no contest in the late antiquity. And then you get this period when the local churches are being run by their kings, and the popes, on the whole, are not doing much about it, or or the emperors are leading reform programs. So the notion that the church is not under the state actually is very unusual in world history, and it starts with Gregory VII. Then, what I've been saying about his lack of common sense, and if you like, he's over the top, his intemperance and so forth. There is, if you think about the saints, there is aspect of them in a lot of the people who are thought of as the major saints. Now, what is a saint? You may be all the saints for all I know. Saint means people canonized by the church, and even that only starts, I should say, really in the 12th and 13th century. But I'm using it now in a common sense way of, like really famous people like Francis of Assisi. Now, think of somebody like Francis of Assisi. You think of, a guy a gentle guy who loves animals. But in fact, Francis of Assisi is an extremist. The way he lives, the way he punishes his body, his idea of absolute poverty, he's an extremist. And if you look at a lot of the saints, they're either, even the ones who are popular, if you look at them closely, they are extremists in some way. And of course, they're not like Jesus Christ because they are imperfect, and their extremism can take the form of doing foolish things. Francis of Assisi is a case in point. He gives up all authority over his order. He says, no more, I'm not going to run this order. And then, long after he's done it, just an ordinary friar, he's telling everybody what to do. And he's telling them with divine authority what to do. God told me, you obey what I say. And some of it is completely unworkable. So I think the people that you're studying when you talk about the saints, they're extremists, and sometimes they do stupid things. Nonetheless, they're giving it all they've got. And Bernard of Clairvaux in the 12th century is another case in point. And one of these things about these saints is they're giving it all they've got. And that means that often people dislike them. Now, I've just been reading a very good book called A Marginal Jew by John Mayer. It's an attempt, it's a historical study of Jesus. But he's a Catholic priest, he's a professor of Notre Dame. He's trying to give criteria for what's historical and what isn't historical in Jesus. And one of the things he says is one of the basic facts about Jesus Christ is this is not some nice guy, who writes essays and is gentle and receives people, because people kill him. He's so extreme that people say, this man has to go. So this element of extremism in the form of normal mortals can take stupid forms from time to time, but it does, I think, constitute one of the elements that when we talk about sanctity in the church that we find. It's extremism in the sense of giving it absolutely everything you've got. And that's what Gregory did. He said some completely unrealistic things, but he was totally taken up with his idea of reform and then the freedom of the church. And actually, nearly all of the things that he wanted came about. So his form of giving it all he's got was pretty effective for church history in general. You don't have to like him, but you can pray to him.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor dAvray, for that very stimulating talk. Anyone who wants to ask questions of the speaker can avail himself or herself of the papers and pens here. Professor dAvray, would you like to address the questions?
Sure. Well, three very good questions, one of which I can't answer, though I could with access to Google. So the first is, how was Gregory VII elected? Did he have bothersome relatives around him that expected his patronage and favours? Two very, it's from Eugénie. Where is Eugénie? Two very extremely well-informed questions, I think. There are two questions. So Gregory was elected in slightly dubious circumstances, because up until a generation before, there had been no rules for how the Pope was elected. It was like bishops. And it's not so abnormal. People of my age can remember when there were no rules for how the leader of the Conservative Party was elected. A leader would just emerge. And it was the same notion that the clergy and people of Rome elected him. But by Gregory's time, there was a rule introduced in 1059 by Nicholas II. And the way Gregory was elected sailed quite close to the wind in terms of following the regulations laid down by the election decree of Nicholas II of 1059, because basically it was popular acclaim with some going through the motions afterwards to make it proper. But there was no rival candidate, and everybody accepted him for 3 years. So that, so I think it was brought